Today's episode is brought to you by our amazing patrons. Thank you to Etiosa, Mike, Corky, as well as to our brand new patron, Renee. Thank you so much, Renee, for jumping on board, joining all the other patrons who are supporting the show. If you want to become a patron, go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com, click on support the podcast, and you can check that out there. So thank you again to all the patrons, and especially Renee for jumping on board. So glad to have you here as part of the Another World family. Welcome back to Another World Audiobooks. So happy to have you here as we carry on with the exciting adventure of the return of Tarzan. Hope you guys are enjoying the book so far. Make sure to check out anotherworldaudiobooks.com. That is where you can go to find the awesome compilations that we put together. So if you like these audiobooks, if you like this narration and all that sort of thing, go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com. There is a Sherlock collection, and that is 5 full audiobooks of Sherlock. And for the price is absolutely incredible, considering the fact that you're getting 5 audiobooks basically for the price of 1. So if you want to check that out, it goes a long way to support the show and help us keep doing what we're doing. So now without further ado, I give you Chapter 17 of The Return of Tarzan. Chapter 17. The White Chief of the Waziri. When the eyes of the black Maniuma savage fell upon the strange apparition that confronted him with menacing knife, they went wide in horror. He forgot the gun within his hands. He even forgot to cry out. His one thought was to escape this fearsome-looking white savage, this giant of a man, upon whose massive rolling muscles and mighty chest the flickering firelight played. But before he could turn, Tarzan was upon him, and then the sentry thought to scream for aid, but it was too late. A great hand was upon his windpipe, and he was being borne to the earth. He battled furiously but futilely. With the grim tenacity of a bulldog, those awful fingers were clinging to his throat. Swiftly and surely, life was being choked from him. His eyes bulged, his tongue protruded, his face turned to a ghastly purplish hue. There was a convulsive tremor of the stiffening muscles, and the Maniuma sentry lay quite still. The ape-man threw the body across one of his broad shoulders, and, gathering up the fellow's gun, trotted silently up the sleeping village street toward the tree that gave him such easy ingress to the palisaded village. He bore the dead sentry into the midst of the leafy maze above. First, he stripped the body of cartridge belt and such ornaments as he craved, wedging it into a convenient crotch, while his nimble fingers ran over it in search of the loot he could not plainly see in the dark. When he had finished, he took the gun that had belonged to the man, and walked far out upon a limb, from the end of which he could obtain a better view of the huts. Drawing a careful bead on the beehive structure in which he knew the chief Arabs would be, he pulled the trigger. Almost instantly there was an answering groan. Tarzan smiled. He had made another lucky hit. Following the shot, there was a moment's silence in the camp, and then Maniuma and Arab came pouring from the huts like a swarm of angry hornets. But if the truth were known, they were even more frightened than they were angry. The strain of the preceding day had wrought upon the fears of both black and white, and now this single shot in the night conjured all manner of terrible conjectures in their terrified minds. When they discovered that their sentry had disappeared, their fears were in no way allayed, and as though to bolster their courage by warlike actions, they began to fire rapidly at the barred gates of the village, although no enemy was in sight. Tarzan took advantage of the deafening roar of this fusillade to fire into the mob beneath him. No one heard his shot above the din of rattling musketry in the street, but some who were standing close saw one of their number crumple suddenly to the earth. When they leaned over him, he was dead. They were panic-stricken, and it took all the brutal authority of the Arabs to keep the Maniuma from rushing helter-skelter into the jungle, anywhere to escape from this terrible village. After a time, they commenced to quiet down, and as no further mysterious deaths occurred among them, they took heart again. But it was a short-lived respite, for just as they had concluded that they would not be disturbed again, Tarzan gave voice to a weird moan, and as the raiders looked up in the direction from which the sound seemed to come, the ape-man, who stood swinging the dead body of the sentry gently to and fro, suddenly shot the corpse far out above their heads. With howls of alarm, the throng broke in all directions to escape this new and terrible creature, who seemed to be springing upon them. To their fear-distorted imagination, the body of the sentry, falling with wide-sprawled arms and legs, assumed the likeness of a great beast of prey. In their anxiety to escape, many of the blacks scaled the palisade, while others tore down the bars from the gates and rushed madly across the clearing toward the jungle. For a time, no one turned back toward the thing that had frightened them, but Tarzan knew that they would in a moment, and when they discovered that it was but the dead body of their sentry, while they would doubtless be still further terrified, he had a rather definite idea as to what they would do, and so he faded silently away toward the south, taking the moonlit upper terrace back toward the camp of the Waziri. Presently, one of the Arabs turned and saw that the thing that had leaped from the tree upon them lay still and quiet where it had fallen, in the center of the street. Cautiously, he crept back toward it until he saw that it was but a man. A moment later, he was beside the figure, and in another had recognized it as the corpse of the Maniuma who had stood on guard at the village gate. His companions rapidly gathered around at his call, and after a moment's excited conversation, they did precisely what Tarzan had reasoned they would. Raising their guns to their shoulders, they poured volley after volley into the tree from which the corpse had been thrown. Had Tarzan remained there, he would have been riddled by 100 bullets. When the Arabs and Maniuma discovered that the only marks of violence upon the body of their dead comrade were giant fingerprints upon his swollen throat, they were again thrown into deeper apprehension and despair. That they were not safe within a palisaded village at night came as a distinct shock to them. That an enemy could enter into the midst of their camp and kill their sentry with bare hands seemed outside the bounds of reason, and so the superstitious Maniuma commenced to attribute their ill luck to supernatural causes. Nor were the Arabs able to offer any better explanation. With at least 50 of their number flying through the black jungle, and without the slightest knowledge of when their uncanny foemen might resume the cold-blooded slaughter they had commenced, it was a desperate band of cutthroats that waited sleeplessly for the dawn. Only on the promise of the Arabs that they would leave the village at daybreak and hasten onward toward their own land would the remaining Maniuma consent to stay at the village a moment longer. Not even fear of their cruel masters was sufficient to overcome their new terror. And so it was that when Tarzan and his warriors returned to the attack the next morning, they found the raiders prepared to march out of the village. The Maniuma were laden with stolen ivory. As Tarzan saw it, he grinned, for he knew that they would not carry it far. Then he saw something which caused him anxiety. A number of the Maniuma were lighting torches in the remnant of the campfire. They were about to fire the village. Tarzan was perched in a tall tree some 100 yards from the palisade. Making a trumpet of his hands, he called loudly in the Arab tongue, "Do not fire the huts, or we shall kill you all! Do not fire the huts, or we shall kill you all!" A dozen times he repeated it. The Maniuma hesitated. Then one of them flung his torch into the campfire. The others were about to do the same when an Arab sprung upon them with a stick, beating them toward the huts. Tarzan could see that he was commanding them to fire the little thatched dwellings. Then he stood erect upon the swaying branch 100 feet above the ground, and raising one of the Arab guns to his shoulder, took careful aim and fired. With a report, the Arab who was urging on his men to burn the village fell in his tracks, and the Maniuma threw away their torches and fled from the village. The last Tarzan saw of them, they were racing toward the jungle, while their former masters knelt upon the ground and fired at them. But however angry the Arabs might have been at the insubordination of their slaves, they were at least convinced that it would be the better part of wisdom to forego the pleasure of firing the village that had given them 2 such nasty receptions. In their hearts, however, they swore to return again with such force as would enable them to sweep the entire country for miles around, until no vestige of human life remained. They had looked in vain for the owner of the voice, which had frightened off the men who had been detailed to put the torch to the huts, but not even the keenest eye among them had been able to locate him. They had seen the puff of smoke from the tree, following the shot that brought down the Arab, but though a volley had immediately been loosed into its foliage, there had been no indication that it had been effective. Tarzan was too intelligent to be caught in any such trap, and so the report of his shot had scarcely died away before the ape-man was on the ground and racing for another tree 100 yards away. Here again he found a suitable perch from which he could watch the preparations of the raiders. It occurred to him that he might have considerable more fun with them, so again he called to them through his improvised trumpet. "Leave the ivory," he cried. "Leave the ivory. Dead men have no use for ivory." Some of the Maniuma started to lay down their loads, but this was altogether too much for the avaricious Arabs. With loud shouts and curses, they aimed their guns full upon the bearers, threatening instant death to any who might lay down his load. They could give up firing the village, but the thought of abandoning this enormous fortune in ivory was quite beyond their conception. Better death than that. And so they marched out of the village of the Waziri, and on the shoulders of their slaves was the ivory ransom of a score of kings. Toward the north they marched, back toward their savage settlement in the wild and unknown country which lies back from the Congo in the uttermost depths of the great forest, and on either side of them travelled an invisible and relentless foe. Under Tarzan's guidance, the black Waziri warriors stationed themselves along the trail on either side in the densest underbrush. They stood at far intervals, and as the column passed, a single arrow or a heavy spear, well aimed, would pierce a Maniuma or an Arab. Then the Waziri would melt into the distance and run ahead to make his stand farther on. They did not strike unless success were sure and the danger of detection almost nothing, and so the arrows and the spears were few and far between, but so persistent and inevitable that the slow-moving column of heavy-laden raiders was in a constant state of panic. Panic at the uncertainty of who the next would be to fall, and when. It was with the greatest difficulty that the Arabs prevented their men 12 times from throwing away their burdens and fleeing like frightened rabbits up the trail toward the north. And so the day wore on. A frightful nightmare of a day for the raiders. A day of weary but well-repaid work for the Waziri. At night, the Arabs constructed a rude boma in a little clearing by a river and went into camp. At intervals during the night, a rifle would bark close above their heads, and one of the dozen sentries which they now had posted would tumble to the ground. Such a condition was insupportable, for they saw that by means of these hideous tactics they would be completely wiped out, one by one, without inflicting a single death upon their enemy. But yet, with the persistent avariciousness of the white man, the Arabs clung to their loot, and when morning came, forced the demoralized Maniuma to take up their burdens of death and stagger on into the jungle. For 3 days, the withering column kept up its frightful march. Each hour was marked by its deadly arrow or cruel spear. The nights were made hideous by the barking of invisible guns that made sentry duty equivalent to a death sentence. On the morning of the 4th day, the Arabs were compelled to shoot 2 of their blacks before they could compel the balance to take up the hated ivory, and as they did so, a voice rang out, clear and strong from the jungle. "Today you die, O Maniuma, unless you lay down the ivory. Fall upon your cruel masters and kill them. You have guns. Why do you not use them? Kill the Arabs, and we will not harm you. We will take you back to our village and feed you, and lead you out of our country in safety and in peace. Lay down the ivory, and fall upon your masters. We will help you, else you die." As the voice died down, the raiders stood as though turned to stone. The Arabs eyed their Maniuma slaves. The slaves looked first at one of their fellows, and then at another. They were but waiting for someone to take the initiative. There were some 30 Arabs left, and about 150 blacks. All were armed. Even those acting as porters had their rifles slung across their backs. The Arabs drew together. The sheik ordered the Maniuma to take up the march, and as he spoke, he cocked his rifle and raised it. But, at the same instant, one of the blacks threw down his load, and, snatching his rifle from his back, fired point-blank at the group of Arabs. In an instant, the camp was a cursing, howling mass of demons, fighting with guns and knives and pistols. The Arabs stood together and defended their lives valiantly, but with the rain of lead that poured upon them from their own slaves, and the shower of arrows and spears which now leaped from the surrounding jungle aimed solely at them, there was little question from the first what the outcome would be. In 10 minutes from the time the first porter had thrown down his load, the last of the Arabs lay dead. When the firing had ceased, Tarzan spoke again to the Maniuma. "Take up our ivory and return it to our village from whence you stole it. We shall not harm you." For a moment, the Maniuma hesitated. They had no stomach to retrace that difficult 3 days' trail. They talked together in low whispers, and one turned toward the jungle, calling aloud to the voice that had spoken to them from out of the foliage.
"How do we know that when you have us in your village, you will not kill us all?" he asked.
"You do not know," replied Tarzan. "Other than that we have promised not to harm you if you will return our ivory to us. But this you do know, that it lies within our powers to kill you all if you do not return as we direct. And are we not more likely to do so if you anger us than if you do as we bid?"
"Who are you that speaks the tongue of our Arab masters?"
cried the Maniuma spokesman.
"Let me see you, and then we shall give you our answer."
Tarzan stepped out of the jungle a dozen paces from them. "Look," he said. When they saw that he was white, they were filled with awe, for never had they seen a white savage before, and at his great muscles and giant frame they were struck with wonder and admiration. "You may trust me," said Tarzan. "So long as you do as I tell you, and harm none of my people, we shall do you no hurt. Will you take up our ivory and return in peace to our village, or shall we follow along your trail toward the north, as we have followed for the past 3 days?" The recollection of the horrid days that had passed was the thing that finally decided the Maniuma, and so, after a short conference, they took up their burdens and set off to retrace their steps toward the village of the Waziri. At the end of the 3rd day, they marched into the village gate, and were greeted by the survivors of the recent massacre, to whom Tarzan had sent a messenger in their temporary camp to the south on the day that the raiders had quitted the village, telling them that they might return in safety. It took all the mastery and persuasion that Tarzan possessed to prevent the Waziri falling on the Maniuma tooth and nail, and tearing them to pieces. But when he explained that he had given his word that they would not be molested if they carried the ivory back to the spot from which they had stolen it, and had further impressed upon his people that they owed their entire victory to him, they finally acceded to his demands, and allowed the cannibals to rest in peace without the palisade. That night, the village warriors held a big palaver to celebrate their victories, and to choose a new chief. Since old Waziri's death, Tarzan had been directing the warriors in battle, and the temporary command had been tacitly conceded to him. There had been no time to choose a new chief from among their own number. In fact, so remarkably successful had they been under the ape-man's generalship that they had had no wish to delegate the supreme authority to another, for fear that what they had already gained might be lost. They had so recently seen the results of running counter to this savage white man's advice in the disastrous charge ordered by Waziri, in which he himself had died, that it had not been difficult for them to accept Tarzan's authority as final. The principal warriors sat in a circle about a small fire to discuss the relative merits of whomever might be suggested as old Waziri's successor. It was Busuli who spoke first.
"Since Waziri is dead, leaving no son, there is but one among us who we know from experience is fitted to make us a good king. There is only one who has proved that he can successfully lead us against the guns of the white man, and bring us easy victory without the loss of a single life. There is only one, and that is the white man who has led us for the past few days."
And Busuli sprang to his feet, and with uplifted spear and half-bent, crouching body, commenced to dance slowly about Tarzan, chanting in time to his steps.
"Waziri, king of the Waziri. Waziri, killer of the Arabs. Waziri, king of the Waziri."
One by one, the other warriors signified their acceptance of Tarzan as their king by joining in the solemn dance. The women came and squatted about the rim of the circle, beating upon tom-toms, clapping their hands in time to the steps of the dancers, and joining in the chant of the warriors. In the center of the circle sat Tarzan of the Apes, Waziri, king of the Waziri, for, like his predecessor, he was to take the name of his tribe as his own. Faster and faster grew the pace of the dancers, louder and louder their wild and savage shouts. The women rose and fell in unison, shrieking now at the tops of their voices. The spears were brandishing fiercely, and as the dancers stooped down and beat their shields upon the hard-tramped earth of the village street, the whole sight was as terribly primeval and savage as though it were being staged in the dim dawn of humanity, countless ages in the past. As the excitement waxed, the ape-man sprang to his feet and joined in the wild ceremony. In the center of the circle of glittering black bodies, he leaped and roared and shook his heavy spear in the same mad abandon that enthralled his fellow savages. The last remnant of his civilization was forgotten. He was a primitive man to the fullest now. reveling in the freedom of the fierce wild life he loved, gloating in his kingship among these wild blacks. Ah, if Olga de Could could see him then, could she have recognized the well-dressed, quiet young man whose well-bred face and irreproachable manners had so captivated her but a few short months ago? And Jane Porter, would she have still loved this savage warrior chieftain, dancing naked among his naked savage subjects? And Dale Not? Could Dale Not have believed that this was the same man he had introduced into half a dozen of the most select clubs of Paris? What would his fellow peers in the House of Lords have said had one pointed to this dancing giant with his barbaric headdress and his metal ornaments and said, "There, my lords, is John Clayton, Lord Greystoke." And so, Tarzan of the Apes came into a real kingship among men. Slowly but surely, he was following the evolution of his ancestors, for had he not started at the very bottom? Man, we're getting far into this book. I hope you are enjoying it. I would love to hear from you, though. What book would you like to hear next after we get done with this Tarzan book? This will be, so we've done a bunch of Sherlock books. I mean, we've done Pride and Prejudice. We've done, what do you want to hear? I want to hear from you guys. Should we do another Jane Austen book? I've kind of thrown around that idea there. Pride and Prejudice has been pretty popular, so we could do, Emma, maybe? I'd love to hear from you. What book would you like to hear next? Get in touch with me. All the links are down below for how to do that. I would love to hear from you. And just ask anybody who's ever gotten in touch with me. As a thank you, you usually end up getting a free audiobook. So not a bad deal there if you ask me. Thanks for listening. Remember to share the show and go ahead and check out anotherworldaudiobooks.com. I think you'll like it. Talk to you next time.
When I was in school, I absolutely hated writing. It wasn't until I was a bit older that I came to understand the power of words. If you're a business owner, you understand that power too. A business blog, when done right, can drive sales, increase revenue, and get you more customers. But as a business owner, you probably don't have the time to do all that writing. Plus, if you're not a copywriter by trade, you might feel like you're just kind of throwing words out there and they're not actually accomplishing anything. The good news is, there's a simple solution. Check it out. I call it the ultimate blog post checklist for businesses with online stores. This checklist will allow you to write better, more effective articles that convert readers into buyers. It's full of easy-to-follow examples to get your creativity flowing based on experience of nearly 1 million words written, and best of all, it's effective on any type of article in any industry or niche. I've successfully used this exact checklist on topics from pool table reviews to investment advice. Tired of spending tons of time writing stuff that doesn't convert? This checklist will change that by giving you highly effective blog posts and articles that transform readers into paying customers. Go to invicta.enterprises/free checklist and start saving time and transforming your writing now. That's invicta.enterprises/free checklist.